It was a warm Saturday evening at the most elegant restaurant in the city. The golden light sparkled against the glass chandeliers, and soft jazz music floated in the air. The tables were covered with white cloths, the kind that looked too perfect to touch. Every seat was taken by people dressed in fine clothes, businessmen, artists, and couples celebrating something special. Among the busy servers moving between tables was Emily, a young waitress with kind eyes and a quiet smile. She carried herself with grace even though she was tired after a long double shift. Emily wasn't like the others who worked there for pocket money or experience. She worked there because she had to. Her mother was sick at home, and the bills didn't stop coming. She had once dreamed of being on the stage herself, not as a waitress serving food, but as a pianist filling the same room with music. She had studied piano since she was a little girl, and her teachers always said she had something rare, a soul that could speak through the keys. But life had other plans. When her mother's illness worsened, Emily had to leave her music school. She didn't complain. She simply found work and kept going, hiding her sadness behind a warm smile for every customer. That night, a loud burst of laughter came from one of the corner tables. It was a group of wealthy people, all in their 40s and 50s, sipping wine and telling stories that made them feel important. At the center of the group sat Richard Langford, a man who carried himself like he owned the world. He was tall, with slicked back hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Emily made in a month. His laughter was sharp and arrogant, the kind that made people look even if they didn't want to. When Emily approached his table with a tray of drinks, Richard barely looked at her. "Be careful with that, sweetheart," he said loudly, his friends chuckling. "We wouldn't want you to drop anything and ruin that lovely uniform." Emily smiled politely, pretending she didn't hear the mockery in his voice. She placed the drinks on the table carefully, making sure not to spill even a drop. But Richard wasn't finished. He liked being the center of attention, and humiliating others made him feel powerful. "Tell me," he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "do they make you memorize the menu, or do you just smile and hope for the best?" His friends laughed again. Emily's cheeks grew warm, but she kept her composure. "I know the menu very well, sir," she said gently, still smiling. Richard raised an eyebrow, amused by her calmness. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. "Impressive," he said. "Maybe you'll get a promotion someday. You know, from serving food to cleaning tables." More laughter. Emily lowered her eyes and quietly walked away, pretending not to care. But inside, her heart ached. She had served rude customers before, but there was something especially cruel about the way he looked at her, as if she was invisible, unworthy of respect. In the corner of the restaurant, the piano player continued his soft tune. Emily paused for a second near the bar, listening to the familiar melody. It was Claire de Lune, one of her favorites. She had played that piece hundreds of times before, back when she still had hope of performing on stage. For a brief moment, the notes reminded her of who she used to be, before the stress and exhaustion of daily survival took over. Richard's laughter pulled her back to reality. He was telling another joke, loud enough for everyone to hear, about people who serve but never dream. Emily tried to ignore it and focused on her work, delivering dishes, refilling glasses, and keeping her smile fixed even when her eyes grew tired. One of her coworkers, Mia, noticed her discomfort. "Don't mind him," she whispered as they passed each other. "He's just another rich guy who thinks money means manners." Emily nodded, grateful for the kind words. But deep down, something stirred inside her, a quiet, determined fire that she hadn't felt in a long time. Later that night, when the dinner rush slowed, Emily stood near the stage pretending to tidy up. She watched the pianist's hands move gracefully across the keys. Her own fingers twitched slightly, remembering the feeling. The keys had once felt like an extension of her soul, her way of speaking to the world. Now, she could only watch. Across the room, Richard noticed her standing there. "Hey, waitress," he called out with a smirk. "Why don't you give us a show, maybe play a few notes for us?" His friends laughed again, thinking it was just another joke. Emily froze for a moment. She could feel every eye in the room turn toward her. Her first instinct was to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard. But something inside her refused to be small anymore. She simply smiled and said, "I'm afraid I'm not on the schedule to perform tonight, sir." Her voice was calm but carried a quiet strength that made even Richard pause for a moment. Then he shrugged, waving her off as if she didn't matter. "Pity," he said. "Maybe next time." Emily turned away, but the flicker of emotion in her eyes remained. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. She knew life had pushed her down more than once, but she still had her gift, buried deep inside. And one day, she thought, that gift would speak louder than his arrogance ever could. As the evening ended, the crowd thinned and the music softened. Emily collected empty glasses, smiled at the few remaining guests, and kept her head high. She might have been just a waitress in that moment, but her story wasn't over. Something inside her heart whispered that fate was waiting for the right moment, one that would change everything. The restaurant was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of conversation. The scent of roasted herbs and fine wine filled the air. For most people, it was a perfect evening. For Emily, it was just another long night on her feet. Her hands were slightly sore from carrying trays, but she didn't complain. She was used to it, the constant movement, the polite smiles, the exhaustion that came only after everyone else had gone home. At the far end of the room, Richard Langford was getting louder. His laughter was sharper now, the kind that demanded attention. His table had become the noisiest in the restaurant. He leaned back in his chair, waving his hand dramatically as he told another story about one of his business victories. His friends listened eagerly, though some looked more entertained by his arrogance than by his tale. Emily tried to avoid his table whenever she could. There was something about the man that made her uneasy. He carried himself like someone who had never been told no in his life, someone who thought kindness was a weakness. Unfortunately, fate had other plans for her that evening. When she went to the kitchen to collect a new bottle of wine, her manager called out, "Table 7 needs another round, Mr. Langford's group." Emily's stomach tightened. "I'll take it," she said softly. She adjusted her apron, balanced the tray, and walked toward the table with steady steps. As she approached, Richard looked up and grinned. "Ah, here she comes, the star of the service staff," he said, raising his glass. His friends chuckled. Emily kept her eyes down and smiled politely. She set the wine bottle carefully on the table, ready to pour. But just as she tilted the bottle, someone bumped into her from behind, a waiter rushing past with a tray of desserts. The jolt was small, but enough to make a few drops of red wine splash onto the edge of Richard's sleeve. It wasn't much, just a faint stain that could be wiped off easily. Still, his face changed instantly. The room seemed to grow quieter around their table. He stood up abruptly, glaring down at her as if she had poured the entire bottle on him. "Do you have any idea how much this costs?" he said, brushing at his sleeve. His voice was calm but filled with venom. The guests nearby turned their heads to watch. Emily froze, her heart thudding in her chest. I'm so sorry, sir," she said quickly, reaching for a napkin. "It was an accident. I'll take care of the cleaning costs." Richard snatched the napkin from her hand. "Oh, I'm sure you will," he said with a cruel smile, "although I doubt a waitress's paycheck could cover a suit like this." His friends laughed softly, the kind of laughter that made Emily feel small. She tried to speak again, but he wasn't done. "Tell me," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Did they teach you how to hold a bottle in waitress school? Or were you too busy daydreaming about tips?" The nearby tables fell silent. Even the piano music seemed to fade for a moment. Emily's face burned. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never be seen again. But she forced herself to stand tall, her hands trembling slightly as she nodded. "I'm truly sorry, sir," she said quietly. "It won't happen again." Richard tilted his head, pretending to think. "You know," he said mockingly, "if you want to impress people, you should try doing something useful, maybe learn an art, like playing the piano." He turned to his friends with a smirk. At least then she'd know how to keep her hands steady. His friends chuckled again, though a few looked uncomfortable now. One of the women at the table whispered something under her breath, but Richard ignored her. He was enjoying himself too much. For him, it wasn't about the wine. It was about power, about making someone else feel small enough to remind himself how important he was. Emily stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Her throat felt tight, but she refused to let tears fall. She bowed slightly and said, "I'll bring you another glass, sir," before walking away as calmly as she could. In the kitchen, she set the tray down and took a deep breath. Mia, her co-worker, rush. Over. "What happened?" Emily shook her head. "Nothing. Just an accident," Mia frowned. "I saw his face. He's awful. You should tell the manager." Emily smiled weakly. "It's fine. People like him, they don't change. It's easier to just let it go." But it wasn't fine. Inside, something stirred. She wasn't angry for herself, it was the humiliation, the way everyone had stared, the way laughter had followed her like a shadow. When she stepped out again, Richard's table was still lively. The pianist had begun playing a soft melody, filling the room with calm. Emily found herself glancing toward the stage. The piano gleamed under the soft lights, its black surface shining like a mirror. She had played on one just like it years ago, back when she believed music could change her life. Richard's laughter echoed once more, pulling her from her thoughts. He was talking about her again. "Some people belong behind the scenes," he said loudly, glancing in her direction. "It's dangerous when they try to step into the spotlight." Emily pretended not to hear, but her heart ached. Still, there was a spark in her chest now, a tiny, glowing ember of defiance. She didn't want revenge. She didn't even want an apology. But something inside her whispered that one day, when the time was right, she would show him exactly how wrong he was. Later that evening, when most of the guests had finished their meals, the pianist began to cough heavily. The music stopped and the manager hurried over, concerned. Within moments, it was clear he couldn't continue. The crowd murmured in disappointment. The piano sat empty, silent. Emily stood near the doorway, her heart beating faster. Maybe, just maybe, this was her moment. The one that fate had been saving for her all along. The restaurant was almost quiet again after the incident, but Emily's mind wouldn't settle. She moved through her tasks mechanically, clearing tables, refilling glasses, and forcing a smile whenever a customer looked her way. Inside, however, her heart was still heavy. She kept replaying Richard's words in her mind. The smug tone, the laughter from his friends, the look of superiority in his eyes. It wasn't just about a little wine on his sleeve. It was about the way he saw her, as someone beneath him. But what Richard didn't know, what no one in that glittering room knew, was that Emily's story went far deeper than her plain apron and tired eyes. Beneath the quiet surface of this humble waitress lived a girl with a soul made of music. Before her life had taken this turn, Emily had been a gifted pianist. Her mother used to say she was born with a piano inside her heart. Even as a child, she could listen to a song once and play it back perfectly. Her fingers danced across the keys like they belonged there. When she played, the world faded away. There were no problems, no bills, no pain. Just melody, rhythm, and freedom. She had studied at a small music academy, working part-time jobs to afford her lessons. Her dream was to perform in grand halls, maybe even compose her own music one day. Her teachers saw the potential in her. One of them even said she could become one of the greats if she kept going. But dreams are fragile things, and reality doesn't always wait for them to bloom. When her mother fell seriously ill, everything changed. Emily dropped out of the academy to care for her. The hospital bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and her savings disappeared. In the end, she sold her piano, her most precious possession, just to keep her mother's treatments going. The day the movers took it away, she stood in the empty room, tracing the marks it left on the floor. It felt like a part of her had been taken too. She started working at the restaurant soon after. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. At first, she told herself it was only temporary, that once her mother recovered, she'd return to music. But months passed, and life kept her too busy to dream. Her days blurred into a routine of polite greetings, tired smiles, and late-night walks home. Still, she never completely let go. Every time the restaurant's pianist played, she listened. sometimes from the corner, sometimes while pretending to clean nearby tables. Her fingers would twitch slightly as if they were aching to join in. There were moments when she'd close her eyes and imagine herself on that stage again, playing under the warm glow of the lights, the audience lost in her music. But then, reality would return. The clatter of dishes, the sound of laughter, the reminders that she was just a waitress now. That night, as the soft melody filled the air, Emily paused near the piano. The pianist, an older man with silver hair and gentle hands, was playing one of her favorite pieces, Moonlight Sonata. The haunting beauty of the notes pulled her in like a magnet. She stood still for a moment, closing her eyes and letting the sound wash over her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said Mia, her co-worker, coming up beside her. Emily nodded. "It's one of my favorites," she whispered. Mia smiled. "You know, I've seen you watching him play before. You love music, don't you?" Emily hesitated, then nodded again. "I used to play," she said softly. Mia's eyes widened. "Really, why didn't you tell me that?" Emily gave a small, sad smile. "Because it feels like another lifetime. I had to stop when things got hard." Mia touched her arm gently. "You should play again someday. You've still got that spark, I can tell." Emily didn't respond, but the words lingered in her mind long after Mia walked away. Play again someday. She wanted to believe it. But in her world, dreams didn't come true just because you wanted them to. As the night went on, Emily found herself stealing glances at the piano every chance she got. The pianist's movements were graceful, effortless. She could almost feel the weight of the keys under her fingers, hear the sound of her own playing echo in her memory. Richard's earlier words still stung. "Maybe you should learn an art like playing the piano." He had said it to humiliate her, but he didn't realize how close he was to the truth. He had mocked her for something that once defined her. The irony burned in her chest like a hidden flame. She caught herself whispering, "If only you knew." Later that evening, when the crowd began to thin, the pianist stood up for a break. He smiled at Emily as he passed. "You look like someone who appreciates good music," he said kindly. Emily returned the smile. "I do very much," he chuckled. "It's a good thing. Music keeps the soul alive even when life doesn't." Then he disappeared into the back room, leaving her standing beside the grand piano, its glossy surface reflecting the dim lights. Her hand hovered above the keys for a moment, her heart pounding. She wasn't supposed to touch it. Waitresses didn't belong behind the piano. But temptation was a powerful thing. She let her fingers press one single note, soft and quick. The sound was pure, gentle, and it sent a shiver down her spine. It had been so long. Too long. Just then she heard voices from across the room. Richard and his friends again. They were laughing loudly, as if the world existed only to entertain them. Emily straightened quickly and stepped away from the piano. But as she walked back to the kitchen, she carried that note with her. That one beautiful sound that reminded her of who she truly was. She didn't know it yet, but fate was already setting the stage. Soon she would no longer be the quiet waitress in the background. Soon everyone, including Richard Langford, would hear what she was truly capable of. The next evening came with the same soft golden light, the same polished tables and the same hum of conversation, but something in the air felt different. Emily could sense it, though she couldn't explain why. It was one of those nights when fate was quietly arranging something behind the scenes, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The restaurant was busier than usual. A local charity event had brought in an even wealthier crowd, and the place buzzed with chatter and laughter. Every seat was taken, every waiter rushed, and every dish came out perfectly plated. Emily moved gracefully through it all, her face calm and professional, though inside she felt exhausted. Near the center of the room, Richard Langford was back again. Same sharp suit, same confident smirk, same loud presence. He sat with new guests this time, but his attitude hadn't changed. He recognized Emily immediately, giving her a knowing glance when she passed his table. She responded only with a polite nod, pretending not to care. As the night went on, the restaurant's pianist, Mr. Benson, played his usual set, a mix of classical and modern melodies that kept the atmosphere elegant and soothing. Emily listened quietly as she worked, each familiar song tugging at her memories. When he started to play River Flows in You, her favorite piece, she almost stopped mid-step. The notes were soft and emotional, like a whisper from her past. She closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath. It reminded her of the years she'd spent learning that very song on an old upright piano in her mother's living room. But just as the music reached its most beautiful point, something went wrong. The piano suddenly went silent. Then a harsh cough broke the calm. Heads turned toward the stage. Mr. Benson was leaning forward, clutching his chest, coughing uncontrollably. Emily gasped and rushed forward along with the manager and a few guests. Someone brought him a glass of water, but it didn't help much. He looked pale and unsteady. I'm fine, he tried to say between breaths, but the manager shook his head. Please, Mr. Benson, you need to rest. Sit down in the back, the manager insisted. The crowd began murmuring. Without the music, the elegant mood of the restaurant started. Without the music, the elegant mood of the restaurant started to fade. People looked restless, glancing at each other. Some even began checking their watches. The manager rubbed his temples, clearly stressed. Great, he muttered under his breath. What am I supposed to do now? Richard's voice rang out across the room. No music? He said loudly, smirking. Well, this is disappointing. I guess some of us will have to survive without background noise tonight. A few people laughed uneasily. The manager forced a smile. We'll have someone fill in shortly, he said quickly, though he had no idea who that would be. The restaurant didn't have another pianist on standby. Emily watched quietly, her heart pounding. The piano sat there, empty, silent, and waiting. Her hands tingled at the sight of it. A thought rose in her mind, daring and frightening. I could play. She looked around. The staff were whispering among themselves, trying to come up with a solution. The manager paced near the bar, clearly frustrated. Emily hesitated, her stomach twisting with nerves. It had been years since she had performed in front of anyone. What if she made a mistake? What if she froze? But then she thought of her mother, of the years she had spent dreaming of that very moment, of the music that still lived inside her no matter how hard she tried to bury it. And finally, she thought of Richard, the arrogance in his eyes, the way he had humiliated her. Maybe this was fate's way of giving her a voice again. She took a deep breath, then walked up to the manager. Sir, she said softly, I can play. The manager blinked. You? Emily nodded. I studied piano for years. I can cover for Mr. Benson, just until he feels better. He looked uncertain. Are you sure? This is a full house tonight. It's not exactly easy to please this crowd. Emily smiled slightly, though her hands trembled. I understand, but it's better than silence. He studied her for a moment, then finally nodded. All right, he said, still sounding doubtful. Give it a try. As she walked toward the piano, the room began to stir with whispers. People noticed the waitress heading for the stage, including Richard, who raised an eyebrow and leaned back in amusement. Well, this should be interesting, he said to his table, his lips curling into a smirk. Emily ignored him. Her heart was beating fast, so loud it drowned out the murmurs around her. She sat down at the grand piano, her reflection shining faintly in its polished surface. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a moment she was frozen. Then she took another deep breath and played. The first notes were soft, gentle, careful, like a whisper testing its strength. But as she continued, her confidence grew. The melody began to flow, rich and alive. It filled every corner of the restaurant, wrapping around the tables like a warm embrace. Her hands moved with grace and precision, as if they remembered every lesson, every late-night practice session, every tear shed in front of a piano she no longer owned. The crowd grew quiet. The clinking of glasses stopped. Even the waiters froze where they stood. Every ear turned toward her music. In that moment, Emily wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't tired, poor, or invisible. She was an artist, powerful, graceful, and full of life. The piano became her voice, and every note carried the emotions she had kept hidden for years. From his seat, Richard stared, his smirk slowly fading. The same woman he had mocked the night before now sat under the spotlight, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. And she didn't need words to do it. just the truth that poured out of her fingertips. As the final note rang out, the restaurant was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into applause. Emily looked up, her eyes shining. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a waitress, but as herself. For a few seconds after Emily's last note, the entire restaurant was silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from boredom or indifference. It was the kind of stillness that follows something breathtaking. People seemed to be holding their breath, not wanting the magic to end. The air felt charged, heavy with emotion and awe. Then, slowly, like a wave spreading across the sea, the applause began. A single pair of hands clapped first, then another, and soon the entire restaurant was filled with thunderous cheering. Some people stood up from their seats, others whistled softly, and a few even had tears in their eyes. The sound echoed beautifully against the walls, mingling with the faint hum of the piano's last vibration. Emily sat frozen for a moment, her hands still resting lightly on the keys. Her heart was pounding, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She hadn't performed for an audience in years. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to lose herself completely in music. For the first time since life had forced her away from her dreams, she felt alive again. She looked up and saw faces, real faces, not customers, not strangers. They were people who had just witnessed her truth. Their eyes were soft, admiring, and full of respect. She smiled shyly, the corners of her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. "Who knew the waitress could play like that?" Someone whispered from the back. "That was incredible." "She should be on that stage every night," another voice added. The manager, who had been standing near the bar in disbelief, finally broke into a wide grin. He started clapping too, louder than anyone else. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said proudly, "please give another round of applause for Miss Emily." The crowd cheered again, even louder this time. Emily stood up from the piano, her legs trembling slightly, and gave a small bow. The lights reflected off the polished surface of the piano, making her seem almost ethereal, like she belonged in that moment more than anyone ever had. And yet, amidst the applause, there was one person who wasn't clapping. At his table near the center of the room, Richard Langford sat motionless, his drink untouched. His usual confident smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression of surprise and something he wasn't used to feeling: shame. He couldn't take his eyes off her. This was the same woman he had mocked, insulted, and humiliated, the same clumsy waitress he had treated like she was beneath him. And now, she was the star of the room. Emily caught his gaze for a brief moment. She didn't hold it long, just enough for him to see the calm, unshaken dignity in her eyes. There was no arrogance there, no revenge, no bitterness, only quiet strength. Then she looked away and continued to bow to the rest of the audience. When the applause finally died down, the manager came over to her. "Emily," he said, shaking his head in astonishment, "why didn't you tell me you could play like that?" Emily laughed softly, her voice trembling. "I guess I just forgot I could." "Well, you remembered tonight," he said warmly. "You saved the evening. That was remarkable." "Thank you," she said with a grateful smile. "It means a lot." The guests began returning to their conversations, though the atmosphere had changed completely. The laughter was lighter now, the energy softer. People were still glancing at Emily, some even walking up to compliment her. "You have a gift," one woman said. "You play with such feeling." "Thank you," Emily replied again, her voice humble. "I just played what I felt." At that moment, Richard stood up from his table. His friends looked at him curiously, unsure what he was about to do. He walked slowly toward the piano, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Emily noticed him approaching and felt her stomach tighten. He stopped a few feet away, his usual arrogance replaced by awkward hesitation. "That was beautiful," he said finally. His voice was quieter than before, almost uncertain. Emily nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." He shifted uncomfortably. "I owe you an apology," he said after a pause. For what I said the other night, I was out of line. Emily looked at him calmly. The whole room seemed to listen, pretending not to. She didn't want to embarrass him, but she also didn't want to pretend his words hadn't hurt. "You don't owe me anything," she said gently. "We all have bad moments. I'm just glad you enjoyed the music." For the first time, Richard had no clever comeback, no smug grin. He simply nodded, his expression sincere. "I did," he said quietly. "More than you know." Then he walked back to his table without another word. As Emily sat back down at the piano, she exhaled deeply. Her fingers hovered above the keys again, and she began to play a softer tune, something gentle and hopeful. It wasn't for the guests this time, or even for her manager. It was for herself. Each note felt like a piece of her heart being put back together. She thought of her mother, of all the years she had spent hiding her gift. Maybe this was what she had needed all along, a reminder that talent doesn't disappear just because life gets hard. It waits quietly for courage to return. By the time she finished her second song, the restaurant was silent again, peaceful, content. The applause that followed was lighter this time, more personal, as if the audience didn't want to disturb the spell she had cast. Emily smiled. She knew this night would stay with her forever, not because of the applause or the praise, but because she had finally reclaimed a part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of how her life was about to change. The applause faded, but the feeling in the room lingered like a soft, glowing warmth. People were still smiling, whispering about the waitress who had turned into a pianist right before. Or their eyes. For a few moments it felt like time had slowed down, like everyone was still caught inside the spell Emily had created with her music. Emily sat quietly on the piano bench, her hands still resting gently on the keys. Her heart was beating fast, not from fear anymore, but from something else, peace, the kind she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since her mother's illness, since leaving the music school, since selling her piano, she didn't feel like life had beaten her down. She felt strong. When she finally stood up, she noticed people looking at her. Not like they looked at a waitress who brought them food, but like they were seeing her for who she truly was. A few guests walked up to her one after another, their faces filled with admiration. "You were amazing," said an older woman with pearls around her neck. "I haven't heard playing that heartfelt in a long time." Emily blushed. "Thank you," she said softly. Another man approached her with a warm smile. "You've got real talent," he said. "Do you perform anywhere else?" Emily shook her head. "No, sir. I haven't played in years." He looked surprised. "Well, you should. You belong on a stage." His words sank deep into her heart, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe them. Across the room, Richard Langford sat quietly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't laughing now or boasting or trying to impress anyone. His usual confidence had melted away, replaced by a thoughtful silence. He watched Emily as she spoke with the other guests, his face softening. When she finally looked in his direction, their eyes met again. This time there was no tension, no anger, only mutual understanding. He gave her a small nod, almost like an unspoken apology. Emily nodded back, accepting it without words. He leaned closer to one of his friends and whispered something. A few moments later he stood up and walked toward the exit, his head slightly bowed. His arrogance had left the room long before he did. Meanwhile, the restaurant manager came up to Emily, still shaking his head in disbelief. "Emily," he said with a grin, "I don't think I've ever seen a reaction like that. You just gave this place its most magical night." Emily smiled modestly. "I just did what I love." "What you love," the manager said, "is exactly what this restaurant needs." He paused, then added, "If you'd like, I'd be happy to have you perform here. Officially, maybe a few nights a week. You'd be paid, of course, and not waitress pay." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Are you serious?" "As serious as I've ever been," he replied with a laugh. "You've got a gift, Emily, and it's about time people heard it." Emily felt her chest tighten with emotion. She had walked into work that night expecting another long shift, another set of orders, another night of invisibility. But now everything had changed. Her heart was full of gratitude, not just for the opportunity, but for the courage she had found in herself. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. her voice trembling slightly. Really, thank you. When the night finally ended and the last guests left, the restaurant grew quiet again. The lights dimmed and the piano stood under the soft glow of the chandeliers. Emily stayed behind for a while, cleaning a few tables and helping the others close up. But her eyes kept drifting toward the piano, the beautiful instrument that had changed everything. When no one was watching, she walked over and sat down again. Her fingers rested on the cool ivory keys. She played a soft, simple tune, something gentle and sweet. The sound filled the empty restaurant, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. As she played, she thought about her mother. She could almost hear her voice. "Don't ever give up your music, my darling. It's who you are." A tear slipped down Emily's cheek, but she smiled through it. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Outside, through the large glass windows, Richard paused before getting into his car. The soft music reached him faintly from inside. He stood still, listening for a moment. Then he smiled, a quiet, humbled smile, and drove away into the night. Inside, Emily kept playing. The moonlight spilled through the windows and danced across the floor, glimmering against the piano's glossy surface. It felt like the universe itself was listening. That night, she didn't just rediscover her talent, she rediscovered herself. She was no longer the waitress who endured cruel laughter. She was the pianist who silenced a room, who spoke through melody instead of anger, and who reminded everyone, including herself, that grace, strength, and beauty can rise from the unlikeliest places. And as her final note echoed softly into the quiet night, she whispered to herself almost in disbelief, "I'm back." The next morning, sunlight spilled gently through Emily's small apartment window, touching the old wooden furniture and the single vase of daisies on the table. She woke up slowly, still half dreaming of the night before. The sound of the piano, the crowd's applause, and the look of surprise on Richard Langford's face. For a moment, she lay there listening to the city sounds outside, wondering if it had all been real. Then she smiled. It was real. Every beautiful second of it. Her phone buzzed with messages. Mia had texted her first, "You were amazing last night. Everyone's still talking about you." Then another from her manager. "Emily, you're officially on the schedule for Friday night performances. Congratulations." Emily covered her mouth, smiling in disbelief. She reread the message several times before it truly sank in. Her dream, the one she'd buried under bills and responsibilities, had somehow found its way back to her. She stood up, walked to her small mirror, and looked at herself. Her reflection wasn't just a tired waitress anymore. It was someone who had found her courage again. Later that afternoon, she visited her mother at the care home. Her mother's eyes lit up the moment she saw her. "There's my beautiful girl," she said softly. "You look different today, happier." Emily sat by her side and held her hand. "Mom," she said with a smile, "you won't believe what happened last night." Her mother listened as Emily told her everything. The rude customer, the accident, the humiliation, and then the unexpected chance to play. When she described how the music filled the room and how people stood to applaud, her mother's eyes shimmered with tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, squeezing Emily's hand. "I always knew you'd find your way back to the piano. You were never meant to serve others' dreams, you were meant to live your own." Emily leaned forward and hugged her mother gently. "It felt like you were there with me," she said quietly. "I was," her mother replied. "Every note you played, I felt it in my heart." That evening, Emily returned to the restaurant, not as the timid waitress who once kept her head down, but as the young woman who had reminded everyone what real talent looked like. The staff greeted her with smiles and congratulations. Even the kitchen staff, who usually kept to themselves, clapped as she passed. "Looks like we've got a celebrity now," one of the chefs teased. Emily laughed. "Hardly, I'm just the same Emily," she said. But deep down, she knew something inside her had changed forever. As she set up for the evening, she noticed a large bouquet of white lilies placed near the piano. A small envelope was tucked between the flowers. Curious, she opened it and found a handwritten note. "For the woman who reminded us all that true class isn't worn, it's shown." She stared at the initials for a long moment. R.L. Richard Langford. For the first time, she didn't feel anger when she thought of him. Instead, she felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It was about proving herself right. That night, the restaurant filled up again and Emily took her place behind the piano. Her name had already begun to spread through whispers, the waitress who could make a piano sing. There was excitement in the air, but Emily felt calm. When her fingers touched the keys, everything else faded away. This time she didn't play with nervous energy or the need to impress anyone. She played with peace, joy, and gratitude. Each note flowed like a story, her story. The guests sat quietly, many with their eyes closed, letting the music carry them somewhere far away. Halfway through her performance, she looked up and noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the restaurant. Richard. He was alone this time. No friends, no arrogance, just quiet appreciation in his expression. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod of respect. Emily smiled softly and continued playing. Her hands moved gracefully, each movement filled with confidence. The melody swelled, bright and emotional, filling every corner of the room. When she finished, the applause came again, warm, sincere, and full of admiration. But what touched her most was the way Richard stood up and clapped too, a genuine smile on his face. It wasn't about status anymore. It was about humanity. After her set, as guests mingled and chatted, Richard approached her carefully. "You were even better tonight," he said. His tone was quiet, respectful. "Thank you," Emily replied kindly. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I was wrong about you. About a lot of things, actually. I thought wealth was power, but last night I learned something different. You had the entire room in your hands with nothing but honesty and music. That's real wealth." Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it takes losing control to understand what really matters." He nodded, a faint smile forming. "I deserved that," he admitted. "Maybe," she said, "but I think we both learned something." For a moment they stood there, the silence between them no longer heavy or tense, just peaceful. Then Richard extended his hand. "Thank you for reminding me what humility feels like." Emily shook his hand gently. "And thank you for listening." As he left, she turned back to the piano, her reflection glowing under the soft lights. She realized that what had happened wasn't just a moment of triumph. It was a turning point. She had turned pain into beauty, humiliation into grace. And in doing so, she had not only changed her own story, but also touched the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. That night, as she played her final song, the music was no longer about proving herself. It was about sharing something real, something that could heal, inspire, and remind people that even in the hardest moments, beauty can rise quietly, like a melody in the dark. When the final night of that extraordinary week arrived, the restaurant felt different, warmer, brighter, almost alive with expectation. The chandeliers sparkled a little more, the guests spoke a little softer, and the grand piano seemed to shine under the golden lights like it was waiting for someone special. Emily arrived early, carrying herself with quiet confidence. She was still in her uniform, but something about her presence had changed. Her steps were lighter, her eyes calmer. The other staff greeted her with cheerful smiles, no longer seeing just a waitress, but someone who had given the restaurant a soul. "Big night again, huh?" Mia said, tying her apron. "Half the guests booked just to hear you play." Emily smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I still can't believe it," she admitted. "It feels like a dream I never thought I'd have again." Mia grinned. "Well, don't wake up then." By the time the evening began, the restaurant was full. Some guests were regulars, some new faces, but all of them had come to hear her. Conversations buzzed softly until the moment Emily sat at the piano. Then, as always, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment she closed her eyes and thought of everything that had brought her here, the struggle, the humiliation, the courage it took to stand up again. She thought of her mother, who had always believed in her, and of Richard, who had unknowingly pushed her to rediscover her strength. Then she began to play. The first notes floated through the air like a sigh, soft and tender. The melody built, gradually, blossoming into something full and powerful. A story told through sound. Each chord carried emotion, pain, hope, forgiveness, and triumph. Her music wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. People listened in complete stillness. Some closed their eyes, Others simply watched, mesmerized. Even the servers paused now and then, moving quietly so as not to break the spell. When the final note rang out, fading gently into silence, the entire room erupted into applause. But this time, it wasn't just polite admiration. It was something deeper. People stood up, cheering, their eyes shining. A few even shouted, "Bravo!" Emily felt tears prick her eyes, not out of pride but gratitude. Among the crowd stood Richard Langford. He was dressed more simply tonight without the usual expensive arrogance. His applause was steady, sincere. When their eyes met, he didn't speak. He just gave her a small, genuine smile. Emily nodded back, silently acknowledging how far both of them had come. After the performance, Richard approached her once more, this time carrying an envelope. "I didn't want to bother you," he said quietly, "but I wanted to give you something." Emily hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a simple letter and a folded check. The letter read, "You reminded me that real worth doesn't come from money or power. It comes from heart. I wanted to do something meaningful in return. This donation will fund a small scholarship for students who can't afford music lessons. It will be named after your mother if you'll allow it." Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at him, speechless. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Richard said softly. "It's the least I can do to honor what you've reminded me of." Tears welled in her eyes as she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. She would be so proud. For the first time, they stood as equals, not a wealthy man and a waitress, but two people who had learned something from each other. That night, when the restaurant finally closed and the lights dimmed, Emily stayed behind for a few minutes. She sat at the piano one last time, running her fingers softly across the keys. The air was still warm with music, and she could almost hear her mother's voice saying, "See, I told you. You were born for this." Emily smiled through her tears. She wasn't just the girl who had been humiliated anymore. She was the woman who turned that moment into a song the world would never forget. When she left the restaurant, the night air was cool and fresh. The city lights shimmered, reflecting off the quiet streets. She looked up at the sky, the moon glowing softly above her, and whispered, "Thank you." From that night on, Emily became the restaurant's official pianist. But more than that, she became a symbol of grace and resilience. Her story spread, about the waitress who stunned the crowd with her piano skills, who turned mockery into music and pain into beauty. And somewhere in that same city, Richard Langford changed too. He began using his wealth differently, supporting young musicians, attending charity events quietly, and never again underestimating anyone because of where they stood in life. For both of them, that single night of music had rewritten everything, and as Emily played her last song each evening, she always remembered the moment she found herself again. The moment she proved that no amount of pride or wealth could ever silence the heart of someone who was born to shine.